All right, thank you all.
Sorry, Peter Pulsifer from Carleton University.
I'll just wait until I can get it up and running here. All right, thanks everybody. As Shannon said, I'm with Carleton University and a research center there called the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center. Before I get started, I'll do a land acknowledgement. I can let you read this. I just want to highlight something I think that's really important. I found this, by searching on an appropriate acknowledgement for this area. And I thought it was really interesting at the end about the idea of pledging to support truth-telling in treaty. And something I really noticed last week when I was in Brisbane is many of the land acknowledgements talked about the fact that we're speaking on stolen land. In Canada, I think because we try and be polite and maybe sweep some things under the carpet, we don't actually talk in that blunt way. And I think it's important that we think about truth-telling and make those true statements. And so I acknowledge the Indigenous owners of this land, their elders, past, present, and future, but also the fact that we are on their stolen land. And I think we need to find a way to move beyond that. With that, I'm going to give you a little bit of a story about our journey at the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center with primarily our Indigenous partners. So we're a research center that's been around for almost 25 years now, started by the late Professor Fraser Taylor, who passed away earlier this year. And I've been working with the center for most of its life as either a graduate student, then as a visiting scholar, and now as the current director. We have primarily worked with Indigenous communities and or knowledge holders, organizations, and I think something that may be a little bit different, not probably unique, but in almost all cases, our projects are actually led by those communities, those organizations, and they actually come to us with resources, with their funding and or other resources, and ask us to be a partner in their project, or they've approached us and asked us to apply for funding with them kind of on their behalf because we're eligible to apply and they may not be. And so this is going to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we've done over the years and where we're going with a tool that we use in the storytelling. A big part of this has constantly been, right from the very beginning when we started this around 2003, 2004, has been on ideas of Indigenous data governance and sovereignty. We weren't calling it that at that point, but right from the outset, our partners talked about wanting to make sure that they could manage the data that was in the systems, that they could control it, that in some cases it was going to be private data. It was not going to be for broad sharing, but they wanted to share it, maybe within their own communities and so on. So this was before, UNDRIP, and it was before CARE and all of those things, but it's always been there. It wasn't before OCAP, or the First Nations in Canada in the late 1990s developed a protocol called OCAP, and that stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. Something that has emerged from our work here relates to the two of those, the access and possession, is that from early stages, the communities that we're working with, knowledge holders and so on, we're very concerned about physically where the data were being held. And so initially we said, well, we've got these servers at the university, and they said, well, who controls those servers? And we said, well, the university does, we've got our space. And they were not comfortable with that. So we worked with them to actually apply for funding more than 15 years ago now to actually develop a data center. This isn't actually ours, but ours looks pretty much like that, where you have the servers that are dedicated. We raised the funds. Legally, they're technically owned by the university, but we have legal documents with every one of our partners that says we take no ownership of the intellectual property, and at any time, basically, they can remove that from the systems. And so this has been a really important part of the process. Everything, I won't go into all the technical details, but every single project has their own what's called virtual machine, so their own dedicated server and things like that. So all of that works together to provide them with some level of data sovereignty and control for their data, because most of the projects are not actually drawing on scientific data. They're the data that's being collected, and data is term we could spend probably all of lunch and beyond talking about, but it's more than just numbers in a spreadsheet. So because we were working in this space, pretty complex space, we developed a tool called Nunalit, and Nunalit is an Inuktitut word for community, and we were really wanting it to be something that was shared with community and between communities. And this just gives you a bit of an overview of some of the things that it does, and it basically tries to bring together everything that's related to the story. And although we are at our foundation a geomatics, which is, as Mark points out, a Canadian word for GIS, remote sensing, all of that. We focus a lot on mapping, but we realized very soon into our projects that it was more than just the map. It was more than just saying, okay, here's a view of the land. There were multiple representations. So oral histories were involved, graphs, timelines, spoken word, all kinds of things. And at the time that we started this, 2003, 2004, there were not many tools to actually do this in an integrated way. So it was long before ESRI story maps in the GIS world and many other tools. So we had to build our own. And so we built our own from a number of different open source tools. And it was important to be open source because we wanted to make sure that there was sovereignty in the sense of not being held to very expensive licenses, which is often the case with certain types of GIS software. And that communities could share. So if one community developed a feature that other communities thought was valuable, that everybody could use it. And just out of a very practical need, when we first started this, there was very little funding. There was very little recognition about the importance of Indigenous knowledge. Nobody really cared about it. So, first projects were basically about what would now be about 5 days of person time would be the entire project. About $5,000 was one of our first projects. So because we were working on such tiny budgets, we had to develop a system that could be reused. So we weren't just saying, oh, this is this project, we'll develop this software and we'll do something different. So we moved towards a platform co-developed with communities that took into consideration things like low bandwidth in the north, all kinds of other things. And I mentioned already the open standards, open source. It started out as actually a very simple project with the community of Igloolik that's been mentioned here earlier. A couple of hundred place names, but very quickly into that where we thought we were just developing a place name map. They were saying, no, we want the map to speak because reading the names is not as important as speaking the names. We want our children to be able to hear the names. So that came about, and then they said we want audio recordings of stories related to those, so that gets into the storytelling. We want videos, and so on and so forth. So this very small project grew into a fairly large one that brought together all of these different pieces. And then we continued from there and started telling all kinds of different stories. So some of them are very hard stories to tell. This one is focused on the residential schools history in Canada over many decades, and it does everything from having archival data, photographs, things like that of what happened there, and then also things like survival stories and survivors actually doing their story mapping in paper that's scanned and so on. So again, just trying to tell these different stories that are quite, they vary quite a lot. From said place names to this case, looking at a horrific history of our nation, to other things like community-based monitoring, where we have people out with Garmin inReach devices who are several hundred kilometers from the community, and they're connecting and saying, this is my story right now, what's happening. I've just harvested wildlife. In one case last year, it actually saved a life because he was several hundred kilometers offshore and his snowmobile caught on fire, burned, and he was able to be rescued using that same device and so on. But it's another kind of storytelling. There are bigger stories as well, like this history of research in Nunavut. So we're working with the Nunavut Research Institute to try and map out all of the projects. They have a licensing requirement and have had for more than 2 decades. So they have thousands of licenses that tell the story of what research has been done. And you can go in now and you can filter by research type and so on. And this is the first version. We're working on a second version that's mobile friendly and all kinds of other things. We're also using this platform, Nunalit, to tell stories of non-Indigenous groups, but typically they're groups that are marginalized or in some other way discriminated against. And so this one is one of our more recent ones, the Black Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. So it's looking at using all kinds of different tools to visualize, to map Black entrepreneurship in Canada to help facilitate and to actually grow that activity. And this one's been interesting because it's one of the groups that had more resources to focus on user interface and the sort of look and feel of it. So we're starting to move into different spaces there. Overall, over that period of time from about 2003, 2004, we have, by rough calculation, about 50 projects that have used the platform, which is great, but at the same time, we're getting challenged because some of this stuff was developed 2 decades ago. And so, as we know, time moves on, technology moves on, and so on. So we're now looking at the next generation Nunalite, and there are a lot of demands that are coming, things are changing, and we have this challenge, though, of how do we maintain what we have, because some of these projects from 2005, 2006, particularly I think of the Gwich'in Atlas. Taro, you mentioned a partnership with Gwich'in. They worked with us in 2008. And we still have an atlas that's up and running, but it's not funded. So we want to make sure that we don't sort of migrate to the new version and say, oh, sorry, everybody else is out of luck. So we're trying to develop a new platform or a new next iteration, I'm calling Nunalite 3 or N3. And so one of the things we want to do is support multiple different kinds of databases on the back end. I'll show you this a bit graphically in a moment. Really enhance the user interface because we've been constrained there that it's been kind of a cookie cutter kind of thing. Here's your UI, and now we want to get into more creative UI so that we can do different kinds of storytelling and also things like mobile responsiveness and accessibility for persons with disabilities, which is now not just the right thing to do, it's the legal requirement. And so we're doing quite a bit of work on that. We're expanding into using different kinds of APIs or application programming interfaces, because when we started, you know, the OGC was it for mapping, and now there's all kinds of different things that you can use. And then getting into AI and machine learning. So I won't say a lot about that, but if you're interested, I can tell you more at a coffee break or something along the lines. A big part of this is what I'm going to call semantic modeling, or actually not just communicating the data, putting the story out there, but trying to help people to understand what the story they're being told, because it may not be coming from their background. So this is just an example from a colleague of mine, Dr. Christy Cotto. And so this is a workshop. It was in partnership with Shannon's Institute and a number of other partners looking at muskoxen, but from the lens of genomics, and looking at can genomics and the new tools out there, eDNA and all kinds of other things, be useful for harvesting, for management, which is not necessarily the Inuit term, but for interacting with the species and so on. But the first step is, do these people who are at each side of the table, the genomics experts and the harvesters, the hunter-trapper associations, even understand each other's language? And the answer was no. So we had a number of workshops where we look at bridging that gap, and to the point where our partners at Kitikmeot Heritage Society have now developed, I think, close to 100 new words in Inuktitut to describe what they're talking about in this project. It goes from things like those little scribblies and, you know, things like that into this is a diagram and a report, but we're then using that to create models, which are called knowledge graphs or ontologies, and those are then getting put into things like actual tools. And so this one's going to be released at the end of December at the ArcticNet conference, but this is where you can go in and a community member can search using their terminology, whether it be in Inuktitut or whether they're saying Arctic char rather than the scientific name. And the software in the background from those workshops will be able to say, okay, I know when you talk about this, you mean that. And not necessarily giving them the genomics data, because it may not be useful to them, but it will tell them there's a study that was done within 100 kilometers of your community by this person, and you may want to reach out to them. So that kind of semantically rich search, so that it's actually a meaningful thing to them as part of this sort of storytelling of their current story in their community. We're trying to serve this from a multi-level architecture. And so at the bottom, the stuff in beige is actually what's already there in our current version. In the new versions, we're going to be bringing in a spatial relational database system, which is just allows us to use different kinds of data in a better, more efficient way. We have what's called graph databases, so those things, those networks and all of that can be represented in that kind of database with those semantics attached in a much more efficient and powerful way. We have what's called an object store, which is for all the multimedia and things. There are new ways of doing that. And then we are experimenting with AI and large language models, but private ones. So with the communities we're working with, we're setting up that infrastructure so we can have their content in something like that, but it's not being incorporated in the larger sort of public commercial large language models. And that's actually part of that system I showed you on a previous slide. So that's the data infrastructure layer. This actually should be what's called the mediation level layer. We have our existing stuff, which is Noonly 2. We have to retain that again so we don't leave all of our partners behind. So we're working to make sure that all these new data sources can actually feed in to the existing ones so they can continue to exist. But we're also developing a next generation model, and I'll go on that in the next slide. And then looking at all kinds of new enhanced front end so that we can tell different kinds of stories set in more sort of exciting ways graphically and with accessibility and things like that. So some of those are already in place, but we're also looking at situations where we may feed into somebody else's AI tools and so on. All of that is future development because there are all kinds of questions there about the ethics of that and so on. In terms of our compound model, there are all kinds of different kinds of data that we're dealing with in these projects that the communities provide or we get on behalf, including what we call vector spatial data, so GIS. We've got gridded satellite imagery, elevation models, media objects, audio, video, and so on, unstructured data, all kinds of texts and things like that. What's called linked open data, which are all those sort of connected graphs, and now AI and large language models. On the metadata side, or the context which is describing this data, we're now trying to move to a more standardized approach so we have ways that you can describe the discovery level, so the types of things like Shannon was alluding to, kind of the mainstream, if you want to find that this data exists, that you can find it out there and it's described, but also the use level, so if you're actually using the data, you have a much better sense of how to use it. Semantics, so all that stuff I was showing you earlier so that you can actually understand the data in detail. Local context is an Indigenous-led system of actually being able to tag and label Indigenous knowledge from the knowledge holders. So we're looking at having that package attached, so if the data goes out of the system, it's very clear on how it can be used ethically, appropriately, and so on. And then things like legal interoperability, so is this actually legal? And I think this speaks a bit to your points, Taro, is making sure that all this stuff is in there so that this downstream software could actually say, yeah, this isn't for sharing. This is for sharing with this group and only this group. It shouldn't be going out there into the public. So moving in that direction so that we can actually have what I call this compound object that has the metadata, the data, and it fits with a number of models out there. But I think all of these can be important parts, or we've experienced over the last 20 plus years, all of these bits and pieces fit together when you're doing the storytelling, when you're actually trying to get those messages across in things that are not GIS or modeling systems, but are non-expert accessible systems. Just for those who care, JSON is how we're implementing this and basically bringing it together and using that as throughput. And our next steps is taking this into actual implementation. So we have one project in particular we're calling Dawich, which is a partnership with the Mishkekawug Council. And so that's going to combine Cree language, Inuktitut, and English all together in a system. The council has done the work over the last 5 years, so they have a huge number of interviews, they have photographs, they have drone imagery, satellite imagery, everything else. They actually have their own GIS department, but they're saying, we want to work with you for the storytelling. And so this one's going to be an interesting sort of way forward on this next generation of the platform. So with that, thank you to our hosts, and thank you in the languages that we actually work in occasionally. So.